When you're thirsty, you can't think of much of anything else. I don't know if any of you remember a story I told several years ago. I'm sure your memory is that good. But I once told you the story of this woman. Her name is Linda Forney. It was in 1975 that she decided that she was going to go and take a weekend hike in the Grand Canyon by herself. And she had hiked before, but she went there and she was on the trail for a little while and was only going to spend the weekend there. She only had a few days' supply of food and water, and she ended up spending 20 days there because she was lost. How many of you have been to the Grand Canyon? Okay, I have not, but I understand it's at least possible to lose the trail. Okay? She did, and she could not find the trail again. And very quickly, her water and food ran out, and just as she thought she was going to die of thirst, she finally found not even a spring or a river or anything. She found a drip, 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 such that she could put her water bottle there and it would take all day nearly to fill up. So she would fill up her water bottle, I guess overnight, and then set out the next day to try to find the trail. She wouldn't find the trail. She would come back, fill up the water again. And she says in this article, the only things I had to eat were buds of cactus plants. As you can imagine, she was desperate. Desperate to be found, desperate for water, desperate for food, and she probably wasn't thinking of much of anything else. Your mind becomes a one-track mind when that happens. Well, she was eventually found, but if I remember the story correctly, it wasn't like a helicopter or something that found her first, but people who lived nearby and thought they had seen something or heard something and finally found her. When you're thirsty, you can't think of much of anything else. This is a painting of the story of the Israelites at the rock that Moses struck to bring water out of. You have to tell you, I sympathize with the Israelites. I mean, what Moses said was that they had a lack of faith. They lacked faith that God would provide for them. And of course, that's true. But have you ever been thirsty? Have you ever been out and about and you haven't had water in a long time and your mouth is dry and it's all you can think about? Water, right? They had to be at that point. They were out in the wilderness, they were in an unfamiliar place, and they started to say, remember several times they started to say, well, at least when we were back in slavery, we knew where we were, we knew that we would eat, we knew that we would drink, and their minds started to become clouded. And of course, God provided for them. When you're thirsty, you can't think of much of anything else. There's this thing called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It basically talks about, you probably can't read it from there, but some of the words it uses are interesting. But it talks about the levels of needs that we have. And the idea is that if on any given level you do not have those needs met, then you're not thinking about things higher up in the pyramid. So, for example, you have physiological needs, food, water, sleep, those kinds of things. And if you don't have that, then you don't have the mental energy to think about things like security, like shelter, employment, resources, even health. You're not going to go out for a jog if you haven't eaten, likely. But if you have all of those met, then you have the energy to think about things like friendship and family. And if you have all of those needs met, you have the energy to think about things like achievement, respect, confidence. And if you have all of those things met, you have the energy to think about things like morality, creativity, and some would say religion or spirituality or whatnot. This is interesting to think about when we think about the woman at the well. She was thirsty. I mean, one of the things this chart illustrates, by the way, is that this is why it doesn't work so well when missionaries and evangelists don't do this much anymore. But you go to a rural village where people are starving, there's maybe a drought or famine, and they're dying of preventable diseases. And you go there and you preach to them. And you say, you are a sinner, believe in Jesus, and you start talking about those things when they are much further down. So what happens? Well, a lot of times what the missionaries found is that they would go to these places where they're not having their most basic needs met, preach to them, tell them to accept Christ, and everyone in the village did. Why? Because they wanted help. They were lower down on the ladder of needs. And so even when they made the missionaries think that we're thinking on this level, it's all a way that they see to get their basic needs met. It's interesting with the woman at the well. There's a lot of things about this story that if you were especially a reader back then, you would have said, there are a lot of things here that are not right. The woman was at the well during the wrong time of the day, noon. You didn't go to the well at noon. You went at morning or night, one of the two. You didn't go in the heat of the day. You didn't go alone. So already, if you were a person living back then, you would have said to yourself, what is going on here? Clearly, she didn't want to be around people because there would have been a time of day that most of the women from the community went to the well to get water. And then, you look at this picture, she's there talking to Jesus. The other thing you didn't see at the well was men. Not even usually men from the town, and if they were there, they were probably up to no good. So she gets to this well, and there is a Jewish man sitting on the well with this Samaritan woman coming up to it. And you heard the woman in the passage, "What are you doing? You ask me for a drink?" And so there's all these things about this passage where Jesus and this woman are breaking conventions. Oh, and by the way, a man and a woman alone outside of town at the well, it's kind of like the closet at the youth group lock-in, right? Only a few of you got that. Not this youth group lock-in, that's right. It's interesting, this conversation with this woman really kind of went up this ladder if you take a look at it. Because first, she's thinking about water. She's talking about water. She says, "You have nothing to draw with. You are a bucketless man. You can't help me." But then it kind of moves on. Oh, wait a minute. Living water? Give me this water. See, at first she thought he was talking about he knew of a spring instead of a well, that would make it easier to draw water. Says, "Well, hey, I'm interested. I don't want to have to come to this well every day." Then it moved on. All of a sudden, they had gone through the whole water bit, and Jesus explained he was talking about something different. And then we get to the part where she says, "Well, I have no husband." And we hear a little bit about her background, which is where we get to the part that we 21st century Westerners usually judge her, because she's had 5 husbands and the man she's with now is not her husband. That usually makes us think of promiscuity, just jumping around and all of that. Back in that day, it could have easily happened. Through divorce, husbands could just decide, "I'm done with you." Could have happened through death, because people did die early, particularly men. Who knows who she's living with now? Could be a father, could be another benefactor, somebody who can't marry her, somebody who won't marry her. I mean, you remember, this is a society where if your husband dies and you're the woman, what are you supposed to do next? Marry his brother so that somebody can provide for you. "I have no husband." And then the conversation keeps moving up. Now we're talking about the esteem and confidence and respect of others, and who am I, and are we legitimate in all of this? And she starts talking about our ancestors worshipped on this mountain. You say it's this mountain. And all of a sudden, they're actually having this religious debate, right? What's the true Bible? Who's the true people? Where's the true mountain? And then finally, I know that Messiah is coming, she says, and Jesus reveals who he is. This conversation went all through it, but at the beginning, we started where she was. She was at water. I'm here for a drink. If I don't get this drink, we're not going to have water for the day. Jesus probably couldn't have started with, she's sitting there, she comes to the well, and for Jesus to go, hey, you know who I am? What's the response? I don't care, I just want water, get out of my way, right? It's very important to start where people are thirsty and hungry. We have to start where people are, don't we? Because if I don't have my needs met down here, I'm not thinking up here. Sometimes we think about these things as in terms of who provides them and where they come from. We might say we have physical things and humans provide them, but then we have the heart things and God provides those. Or we might think, no, see, all the physical and emotional things humans provide, but then there are these spiritual things, religion and church and all of that, and that's God's area, or however it is we think of it. But I'd like to suggest to you that one of the things Jesus did was that he made everything spiritual. He took simple things like bread and wine and illustrations like water and farming and wineskins, and he said, all of this is spiritual. He said, God is interested in this stuff. He said, if you do whatever you do to the least of these, you've done it to me. He said, you are still doing spiritual work. You are still doing God work when you're down at the bottom with people who don't have some of their basic necessities met. What if all things are spiritual and God provides these things with and through us as we seek to meet people where they are, where their thirst is? For my Doctor of Ministry project, this is kind of what we asked the community. My Doctor of Ministry project started with community interviews where we basically went out and said, what is the community thirsty for? We said, where are people? Where are they right now so that we know where they're not going to be thinking ahead? And here's what we found. You probably can't read it, but the community, we asked, what are the needs and problems that you see? We asked people like the director of the jail, the Shawnee County Correctional Facility, director of Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Breakthrough House. We went to 10 different places and asked them, what are the needs? And they said things like public awareness, stigma and stereotypes. And then we also looked at what they had to contribute. We found that people in the community are very creative and flexible, that they're all about partnerships and collaboration. And then we asked the big question, where do churches fit? Where do you wish, we asked these people, churches were plugging in? And the top two things that were mentioned were mentoring and building long-term intentional community. They said that is where the thirst is. Then we interviewed you. We asked you about your most alive time in the church, what you contribute to the church, what the church has contributed to you, and how you think we're unique. We heard a lot about community and acceptance and inclusiveness. We heard about spiritual leaders and mentors. We heard a lot about relationships and mentors. That sound familiar? Mentors and relationships is where the community said they wish churches plugged in. What did you say we have? Mentors and relationships. So what if we said there is this need, there is this thirst? What has God given us to address it? if you have the need for mentors and long-term support networks. We have tight-knit small groups. We have mentors and teachers. We know that we support each other in a time of need. I guess the trick is to not keep it stuck in this building. They said there's a need for seeing past stigmas and stereotypes. Sorry about the typing there. What has God given us to address that thirst? You said we're inclusive and accepting, that we have great leadership, that we practice service and hospitality. I guess the trick is to not keep it stuck here. I recently went to a presentation on NetReach. Have any of you read about this in the newspaper? It's based out of the old Avondale East Elementary School. And it was started by the Rescue Mission in partnership with the Community Resources Council and Fellowship Bible Church, the other FBC. And they are over there in the High Crest neighborhood. That's what that neighborhood is called, High Crest. And they are doing, guess what? Mentoring and long-term relationships. They told us about some of the needs that are over there. 92% of children living in poverty in that neighborhood, 55% of adults. They struggle with gangs, they struggle with substance abuse. They tell us that there are a few homes in that neighborhood that people live in, but the utilities have not been turned on in years, the water or the electricity. And what they kind of discovered is that there is a lot of thirst, literal and otherwise, in this neighborhood, and we're not so sure that they can find the water that they need on their own. And they found they need mentors, they need people to come alongside them, they need long-term intentional relationships. And so that's what they're doing. They're trying to reach this mentoring goal. They've already trained some mentors. They've already paired up people with people who need to be mentored. This gentleman here you see in these pictures and the sign, through the NetReach program, he was able to start his own Mexican food business. It's not really a restaurant, it's just a little place, but he was able to start his own business. And they didn't tell us until the end, when they shared his story, that the lunch we had been having, the burritos that we had for lunch, were made by him. That was a really cool thing. But through just somebody coming alongside him, he had a dream, he had a thirst, he wanted to provide for his own family, but he just couldn't find a way to do it. He needed a few things that he wouldn't have known how to get on his own. And so they came to him and came alongside him. And now, what does he know? He knows that the thing he is most wanted to do, provide for his family, was made possible by people who call themselves Christians. That's going to go somewhere. There was a lady there at the meeting talking about some of these programs, and when she was finished, another pastor there raised his hand. This was for pastors, this meeting. And he said, "That was great stuff. When would you be able to come and talk to my church about this, about how we can do some of this?" He said, "Would you come? Would you be willing to come to my church and talk to us?" You know what the lady said? No. She said, "You come here." So that's what we want to do, isn't it? We want to turn everything into another church program. It's like, how do we do it here? That looks cool. Why don't we do it here? And this lady it's the most wonderful and blunt answer I've ever heard. And I'm glad it wasn't me that asked the question, because I probably would have. She said, "No, that's not what we do. We don't go to churches and speak and tell you how to start this. You come here. We've got the thirsty people here. We've got the groups coming together to form the resources. We're going. Come alongside us if you want to," is what she said. Because you see, when people are thirsty, they might not always know where to find the water when people are thirsty, they might not know what to do next, and they might only be able to think about that thing that they are thirsty for. And I want to remind us today that that's where God started with each of us. You know, there's always a thirst that we have that somehow, through God and through the Christian community or something, that thirst has been quenched. You know, I realized several years ago that all of us start out going to church for the wrong reason. Did you know that? Even if you grew up in church, you started going to church for the wrong reason. I grew up in church. I was in church since I was a baby. What was my first reason for going to church? I was drug along. The wrong reason. We all have a thirst. And that's why God has this thing called the church.